So this has been a long time coming. I have been aware of this man's work for some time. He has been, and his Twitter biography says Afrikaner commentator, but he is far more than that. He is Willem Petzer, who's also not afraid of controversy, not afraid to go back to first principles when it comes to trying to figure out the way that South Africa has evolved, particularly over the last 20 years or so, but also before that. And for that reason alone, I am very, very keen to speak to him. He's also a big student of history and engages with many people across all the political spectrum and across academia, across the media, and everywhere else. He's a free thinker. I like to, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, Willem, but you're a free thinker. You're someone who's also particularly interested in Afrikaner issues. And I think that suddenly, thanks to the hard work of people like you, it's become fashionable and acceptable again for people to talk about Afrikaner issues without having to apologize and do land acknowledgements for 15 minutes beforehand. Certainly in the left-wing media, I've never been interested in that stuff. So it's a great pleasure to meet you properly for the first time. And I'm sorry that this is online. Next time we'll do a coffee or a beer or something. How are you?
Very good, and you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very good. We've got lots to talk about, so let's get straight into it. Afrikaner issues and the story of the Afrikaans people, it kind of stops for some in 1948, right? And then for other people, it stops in 1994. And I know Afrikaans people, ek het Afrikaanse familie. I know Afrikaans people who prefer not to pay attention to their own history and culture. There is, of course, some kind of revival going on. It has been for some time. But what do you think the state of mind and the state of culture of Afrikaners is right now?
Well, I think Afrikaners are starting to wake up to a sense of belonging. Whereas if you look at the pop culture within the Afrikaans sphere of, let's say, the early 2000s, you had your bands like Volkhof Polisiekar and those guys. They were popular amongst the Afrikaner youth. And they had sort of this message of shame of being an Afrikaner and, started almost, walking away from this identity and who our history is and so on and so forth. And I think within that generation, if you ask them, who are our heroes? Very few people would actually be able to, answer that question. They would probably not even be able to name one person. And I think all of that changed with Bok van Blerk when he released the song De La Rey. That was the first positive pop culture reference to Afrikaner history that we have seen since 1994. And suddenly you have all of these youths singing De La Rey, but none of them really even know who De La Rey is, just that he was some militarist and a general that fought against the British. But I think from there it became a lot more acceptable on the one side for the Afrikaners to actually explore who they are and their identity. But then on the other side, you have the ANC pushing their history onto us. And it becomes worse and worse and worse. Before we started this interview, I told you that if you just merely quote the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission over apartheid, you will be called an apartheid apologizer by today. Because the general consensus of history has shifted so much to the favorability of the ANC that actual facts don't even matter anymore. Just to give you an example of this, if we look at the rhetoric used to justify some of the human rights abuses we are seeing today, particularly against Afrikaner people, but also against white people in general, what they would use is a certain revisionist history that they have over the apartheid era. And this, if we can boil it down to a few sentences, basically comes down to a genocide being committed against black people during apartheid. I can't say it anywhere other, because that is truly what I think most of the black youths and the general consensus amongst the mainstream media and so on is on this particular part of history. So we have done this series on my Afrikaans channel called The Truth About Apartheid, or Die Waarheid oor Apartheid, where we try to go back to primary sources, not academic journals that were written in the past 10 or 20 years, but what did the people actually think during this time? what was actually happening here and what was their motivation for implementing the vast set of laws and restrictions we today know as apartheid. And that's what sort of got me into this, was not the fact that there was a cultural revival, but more the fact that I think that we need to oppose the narrative put forward by the ANC today, because if we allow this to continue, things are just going to get much worse and worse and worse. And in 10 years' time, they would basically, I don't even know what can be worse than what they say happened currently, but it would justify more radical laws punishing us for so-called sins of our forefathers, and somebody needs to put a stop to that. And I think the fact that I also have a very large overseas audience watching my videos is a very good sign, because if you look at America, for example, their understanding of apartheid is being shaped by voices like my own, and I think that is very important. Another interesting thing that I want to mention is the fact that apartheid as a word, literally separateness, or it's basically the Afrikaans word for segregation. You know, to segregate means to make separate in broad terms. So segregation is the policy of making separate, which is exactly what apartheid means. But if they sort of criticize countries like, let's take Israel, for example, everyone's saying we must end Israeli apartheid, not Israeli segregation. So there's more to this word than its actual meaning, which is segregation. It's like it's a completely different, or let's call it amplified way of saying segregation. And I think that just shows you what the international perception towards apartheid or this word is, that they use this word if they really want to criticize another country, like Israel, for example. And
it's because victory's been declared here, right? So they have
yes.
They have a reference point, and this happens all the time in history. People use words to try and infuse existing modern current situations with all kinds of past feelings, past ideas, past victories, past failures. And I think that that's largely happened in South Africa. And I'm afraid to say, and I'm glad to see that you and your series are doing well, and it's doing well internationally. But I'm afraid to say there's actually very little curiosity in South Africa about apartheid, because people just have a category of bad stuff that they put into the word apartheid, and they just throw it into the conversation casually and in a cavalier way. And it's actually very dangerous to do that. It's like any period of history. If you aren't prepared to go and do the detailed research and actually pay attention to it, and I very much doubt that most people in South Africa have actually ever done any proper research into the period of apartheid. They know about the stuff that's been propagandized largely over the last 20 to 30 years. You know, we all know about the riots in Soweto. We all know about the political prisoners who were put in Robben Island. We know about Rivonia. We know about what an evil man Verwoerd was. And it's easy to create this pastiche of history, because it allows ignorant people a very quick reference point so that they can sound as if they kind of know what's going on. But, I mean, what sort of stuff have you discovered when you went back to those primary sources that surprised you? Because, you know, I want to be careful here not to give anyone who doesn't like you already, or who doesn't like me, the opportunity to just disregard this as apartheid apology, which, you know, there are people who are going to call it that regardless. But I think that you've got some interesting findings that I'd like you to share with us for people who might not have yet seen the series or what you're planning to do next.
Well, I think the most interesting thing that I found out that I never knew was looking at Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd's time as the Minister of Native Affairs, which was in the 50s, and which was also the time of the Bantu Education Act, which he was a big proponent of. And if we look at Hendrik Verwoerd today, the general consensus would be that he was this massive racist, evil planner that just wanted to come up with all these massive, elaborate 4D chess plans in order to make black people suffer. But if we look at the way that he was viewed during that time, it is very interesting that he was viewed as this liberal Dutchman. And I say Dutchman because Verwoerd can be seen as sort of an honorary Afrikaner, because he wasn't even born in South Africa. He was born in the Netherlands. He was a Dutchman. He wasn't an Afrikaner before he sort of assimilated into the culture of the Afrikaner. And other people during his time were criticizing him for being way too egalitarian. So to give you an example, the Bantu Education Act was, in his words, an idea that he had to improve the literacy rate amongst black people. That was first and foremost the first letters we see where he starts talking about this concept. The main issue he was addressing was the fact that the vast majority of black people during that time was still illiterate, and that needed to be fixed. So when people talk about the Bantu Education Act, usually they would say things like, a lot less money was spent per black child than per white child, and that's the end of it. But nobody asks, what did Verwoerd actually take away from the black communities? Or what did he actually give to the black communities? What was the education system like before Bantu education was introduced? And the reality is that there was not really an education system in the black communities before Bantu education. The one or two schools that actually taught black children were mostly German, English, Scottish missionaries that set up these schools. And while these schools did get state funding, it was impossible for them to actually educate all the black children. So who did get educated? And this is another very interesting concept. People like Nelson Mandela, who was basically a prince or an adopted prince in the Xhosa community.
The tribal aristocracy. That's people like Pixley Kaisakaseme, for example, in KZN as well. But this was the very few. It was an elite within the black community at that, if it was a community, because it was still largely tribal at that point. But you're saying there wasn't very much available to the average black child anyway before Verwoerd came along. So you made the point earlier, and I'm fascinated by this, that many others in the government at the time, and even people in the press, criticized him for being too equality-focused, too interested in trying to raise the standard of black people's education with white taxpayers' money.
It wasn't because he was raising the standard of black education. It was because if you look at the Afrikaner people's history before the 1950s, they were absolutely destitute. I mean, after the Second Anglo-Boer War, with the concentration camps and a third of the women and children population being wiped out, and the fact that there was the scorched earth policy, most of these people, their profession was farmers before the war happened. And when they got back to their farms, their kids and their wife was murdered, and their farm was burned down. There was nothing left there. They had no money. They had no way of restarting their farming. So the land meant nothing. They had to move to the city because they couldn't farm as a profession anymore. They had to move to the cities and start working on the mines that were recently taken over by basically Rothschild-backed companies such as Anglo American under Cecil John Rhodes. And there they had to work themselves up from basically nothing. And then fast forward about 50 years to the 1950s, and the Afrikaner was able, in a very short time, to uplift themselves by themselves economically from absolute destitute state to a state where they were probably one of the most wealthy peoples on earth. If you would have compared the wealth of the average Afrikaner in the 50s and the 60s to any European nation, it would basically, in that area or that time, especially before World War II, basically only have been the Germans and the English that were wealthier on average than the Afrikaner. The rest of Europe wasn't, France wasn't, etc. And they sort of viewed this as their money that came from blood and sweat that they worked so hard to build up, despite the gold mines being taken away from them by the English after the war, despite their farms being destroyed. They were able, through hard work and communitarian efforts, to build up this wealth. And then you have letters from Dr. Albert Herzog towards Dr. Verwoerd, in which he heavily criticized him. He said, you can't do this. This is our money. We worked so hard for this. You can't just go out and start giving our money away. This money needs to go to our children and our children only. This money needs to go to poor whites or poor Afrikaners only. This money should only be reserved to uplift our people even further, to ensure prosperity for our children and our children's children. He was very angry at Dr. Verwoerd for implementing the Bantu Education Act. So what did the Bantu Education Act do is it basically stopped government funding to those few elite missionary schools and said that we are going to set up a system where there is enough schools so every single black child can go to school and at least reach grade 7, basically, if you want to speak in today's terms, where you at least have a level of functioning literacy, where you can at least read for meaning. That was the goal of it. And the apartheid government and Bantu education was very successful in this goal because by 1994, when the ANC took over, illiteracy amongst black people was less than 10%. And the illiteracy amongst black people were mostly older generation people. The younger generation was mostly taught how to read and write for meaning. And I think that if you then compare Bantu education to what we have right now in South Africa, and this is where it becomes really controversial, then I would be, based on historic evidence, I would be able to say that the current education system for black kids in South Africa is far worse than Bantu education was, because the actual literacy rate has declined significantly among black kids since Bantu education was stopped. And I base this on some studies that was done by some humanitarian groups on how many of South Africa's 15-year-olds are functionally literate, can read and write for meaning. And some of these studies, there's quite a few of them, but on the higher end, some of these studies says that more than 80% of South African children aged 15 are not functionally literate. That is what we have today. So if they say they want to reverse apartheid, they are doing a very good job at reversing the Bantu education system. And then if we dig deeper into Bantu education, we see, I think it was somewhere in the 1970s, the so-called Afrikaans Medium Act was passed, where they started introducing Afrikaans medium education into the black schools in the Bantu education system, and they were heavily criticized for it, and there was a lot of protests against this Afrikaans medium education. But if you go back and you look at the reasoning before this act was passed, why they wanted to pass this act in the first place, it wasn't to create some sort of Afrikaans supremacy. It was a way that they wanted to improve Bantu education. Because during that time, only 1 in 3 of the teachers at black schools, black teachers, were actually qualified teachers. Qualified in the sense that they had some sort of tertiary education that equipped them with the knowledge to teach kids. Others were semi-educated. They basically had the equivalent of matric, and then they would become a teacher. And they, for 20 years, they tried in order to educate black teachers, but it wasn't going fast enough. And then they said, well, we do have a surplus of Afrikaans white teachers currently. We have to send our Afrikaans teachers to these schools in order to improve the quality of education there. And the teachers then said, but we can't teach in Zulu and in Xhosa or in English or any of these languages. I only feel capable of teaching in Afrikaans. I don't have the skill to teach in another language. And that's where the act was brought in. And it didn't force the kids to get education in Afrikaans. It only introduced Afrikaans as an alternative medium to these schools. So if you look at the actual facts and the actual arguments, look at the source documents, you see a completely different picture than what is painted today. The picture that they tried to paint in that time as to the arguments why they would introduce these was purely egalitarian.
That's amazing. And I don't know that very many people know that stuff. You know, it's easier to just throw Verwoerd into the villain category and to say that the Bantu Education Act was a primary motivator to try and keep black people underfoot.
And then, if I can just add something to that, sorry, Gareth. My mother is a teacher, or was a teacher at, well, not a teacher, actually a lecturer at the Tshwane University of Technology in the early 2000s. And she taught Xhosa and Zulu. She taught black languages at this university. And the program where they started to try and actually educate people in university in their own native African languages was stopped. It's only English now because they failed to ever build the black languages up to an academic standard where you can actually teach technical subjects in an African language. It's simply not possible today. Verwoerd's idea was that he was going to uplift not only the people but the language so that people can start doing PhDs in mathematics and physics in Zulu or in Tswana. But if you look today, that also failed under the ANC, that process. It also regressed to a level where they don't even try anymore. Because I remember when I was at university, there was this big upheaval made of one student that did his PhD in, I think it was Tswana, but it was in the humanities.
Yeah.
Today, there has not since ever been anyone that completed any technical doctorate in a black language. And I think that if the system was allowed to continue, maybe today there would have been a guy that could have completed his physics doctorate in a black language. But under the ANC, that failed. That never happened.
It's very sad to me because I do think the Afrikaners have done a sterling job of creating literature, poetry, technical language, music, and a sophistication around Afrikaans that wasn't there in the late 1800s and even up to the early 1900s. My great-grandfather, Gustav Schoeman Prelle, led the Tweede Taalbeweging, along with, people like Eugene Marais and Langenhoven and sulke mense. And they tried to make Afrikaans. And, you can tell the difference between a kombuistaal, something that people speak colloquially, and a language that actually has, more than 3 or 4 words to describe a particular thing. And in science and maths, it doesn't just use English terminology with their own fails. And Afrikaans largely got to that place very quickly. It saddens me that we sit here and we boast about having 11 official languages, and really only 2 of them have the vocabulary and the technical makeup to be able to justify doing a degree in those languages, which is really our fault as a country. But it's even more damning for the ANC, who assured us that this was one of their things they wanted to rectify. So let's get back to Afrikaners for a second, because I'm fascinated by how the history has changed. You mentioned shame a little bit earlier on, and how, in the 90s and possibly even into the 2000s, and there are people today who are still behaving like this. There are Afrikaners who are deeply ashamed of their history, who don't take the active interest in it that you do. Are you starting to see that change? And what kinds of things, besides pop culture that you've already mentioned, are starting to influence those decisions?
Oh, most definitely. I think we start seeing it in politics now. If we look at someone like Piet Kroukamp, for example, who was a professor of political sciences, he was quite popular 5 years ago. Or no, not 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. He was quite popular, he was on all these shows, and he was the guy that they called on RSG to explain some political concept and so on and so forth.
Just for people who don't know him and are listening to this now, a lot of people call him Kopdoek. He wears like a sort of a, what would you call it? A thing over his head that he ties at the back. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but he's the guy who you actually were meant to have an interview with this week, but he's chickened out as usual. You ended up talking to Summer Sambit and to Kali Kriel. But how has it changed? Obviously, academia, there's a much slower change there. But I'm talking about society as well, and young Afrikaans people.
No, I was trying to make the point that he was quite popular 10 years ago, and now nobody likes him. Like, you will be very hard-pressed to find anyone under the age of almost 40 that has any sort of respect for him. And I think that shows you a cultural shift. But I think there's also a negative cultural shift happening. And I've talked to some people about this who are quite older, who were actually, lived under apartheid and all of that sort of stuff, that fought in the border war. And they tell me that the amount of almost blind hatred and racism that they see, not just from Afrikaners, but from all younger white South Africans, once these guys had a few beers at the braai, is much worse than anything they have seen during their own youth. They didn't really hate black people in the sense that they would actively wish harm upon black people. And I think there's a little bit of a negative cultural shift there, where young white people today are getting so frustrated that they go one or two ways, or they become very, very left-wing and liberal, in the sense that they sort of embrace that idea that everything is their fault and they need to take collective punishment for some sins that happened 100 or 200 or whatever amount of years ago, or they go completely in the other direction and they just have resentment for what is happening here today, and would make comments like, I don't even want to repeat it on air, but some very vile comments.
I think this is also a lesson, and it happens all over the world. So it's not just a South African problem. It happens all over the world that when people are excluded, and I think that this current ANC administration is starting to realize, even if it doesn't want to, that excluding whole groups of people and really only talking in your silos has the effect of making those people more and more kind of insular, off to the side. They start having their own conversations that don't include the country or the big picture. And I think that they're starting to reap the whirlwind there. Let's focus on the positive stuff, though, because obviously with your interest in your research in the history of apartheid here and the truth about apartheid, what kinds of other surprising things have you discovered? We mentioned Bantu education, but let's talk about some of the other big ones, because often when we hear about apartheid, people talk about the Group Areas Act. They talk about the Immorality Act. These are things which are often brought up as examples of just how evil apartheid was. It separated people into neighborhoods. It separated them across cultural and ethnic barriers so that they couldn't marry. There were all these things that were so evil and wicked, and we look back on it now, and it's clear to us that they must have been evil and wicked people.
I think that if you look at the narrative that is being used today to justify all of these so-called restorative justice laws, then there's two things that are mostly mentioned. One was the one that we already discussed about Bantu education. The other one is the question concerning land. And
Yes.
If we look at what happened in 1913, this was obviously a lot, many, many decades before apartheid started, but this was under the time of Louis Botha, and it was basically still Britain governing South Africa through proxy. And the Group Areas Act, what it basically did was it stopped any sale of land in the black, or the areas that were black controlled, from being sold to white and in many cases also Jewish landowners. And it also stopped any area in the white area from being sold to black individuals. It basically just said, here's a split. You're not allowed to buy any land in our area, and you're not allowed to buy any land in their area, and so on and so forth. And the reason why this actually happened was not because they wanted to exclude black people from owning land. It was because there was a very rapid pace of black chieftains selling their land to investors, or yes, mostly European investors, especially concerning the fact that there was now all these prospecting happening. There was a lot of money flowing into South Africa from Europe, mostly Rothschild money by that time, because at that time the Rothschild family was it was the richest family in the world, and they had so much money to spend, and they thought they were going to make so much money out of South Africa. But in any case, that's not the case anymore today. But so all of this money was flowing in here, and all of these people were just starting to buy up the land from the black chieftains in order to prospect, in order just to hold on to this land as an investment for, if maybe something happens in the future where this land becomes valuable, or just to farm, because the best agricultural land in the country has always been in the black homelands. I made a tweet about this.
Just hang on. I want you to just explain that, because this is something which to some people will sound like absolute nonsense. When they created the Bantustans, you can give us the history of how that was decided and why those areas were cordoned off. The popular opinion and the general line that is towed by the press and by most academics today, and they never challenged on this, is that the Bantustans were the really terrible parts of South Africa that were unworkable. We needed to push black people in there. The government was of the opinion that those were the areas that they should be put in and forgotten about.
Okay, so I just switched here so you can see on the screen. It's a tweet that I've made. And what I've done is I've had this map that shows the arable soils for rain-fed agriculture, meaning basically any agriculture, because the only other type of agriculture is irrigation-fed agriculture. But you can't farm any animals on irrigation, and irrigation is really not a large-scale operation that you can do anywhere unless there's rivers and lots of water. If you look at these maps, you'll see that the areas in which the Bantustans was later made basically correlates perfectly with the vast majority of the country's high potential and moderate potential agricultural land, especially in the Eastern Cape. You'll see here in the Transkei, which is the orange area, that there's this little cookie bite that's taken out of the Transkei. And then if you look next to it on the map of arable soils, you'll see that exact cookie bite is exactly where the area is that is not suitable for agriculture. So now the question comes, what is the reason for this? Because everyone think that the Bantustans was given to the black people. Like, this is yours, you can have this because it's crap and we'll take the good stuff for ourselves. Yeah. But it was never given to them. That was just the areas that they settled in. That was the areas where black tribes actually had land before the 1913 Land Act. And just to mention it, I wanted to get to that in the previous time I talked. Much later, Hendrik Verwoerd actually expropriated a lot of land from white farmers to give it back to the Bantustans. And that's all the land that was sold before the 1913 Native Land Act. And he said he wants to fully restore all the land that they had before they started selling them off. So he expropriated the land from white farmers mostly and gave it back to the Bantustans. And to get back to why that is so, and why this area, which is by far the best agricultural area in South Africa, was then within the Bantustans, it's just because they settled there because they didn't have the technology to actually survive anywhere else. 60% of South Africa's surface is desert or semi-desert. You cannot, on large scale, survive in the desert. You know, the San people did, the Bushmen did, because they usually lived in very small groups, which is basically a family of 8 or 10 people, never bigger than that. And they got a lot of their water from wherever there was some oases, or they would get it from
hunter-gatherer society stuff. Yeah.
From, just like these little watermelons that grow natively in the Karoo, like Kukamakrankas and stuff. And but on a large scale, if you have like a semi-agrarian society or subsistence agrarian society, which most Bantu peoples were, it's impossible to survive there. You need water, because if you don't get a lot of water to have everyone and your animals drink, you'll die. And the same thing goes for other areas of the country, which is not in that western half that is desert or semi-desert, but in the Highveld, for example. The area, to the east of Johannesburg, Mpumalanga today, also large parts of the Free State is grasslands. And you also can't survive on the grasslands or the steppes without Western technology, because there's a lot of rain, but there's very little water sources. If you want to have water in these areas, you're going to have to drill a well, and then maybe have a windmill pumping the water up so you can have a constant supply of water. But without it, there's no way that you can survive. And the Bantu tribes never developed the technology of digging a well. They simply didn't even know that if you dig a well, you can get water under the soil. They didn't understand the concept behind it. When they came across natural wells by accident, they didn't understand why the natural well was there and why it existed or why there was water at the bottom of the spit. It was just like, oh, here's water. And some of them used these wells, and then they would exploit it, and then the well would dry up because they would use all the water, and they wouldn't know that, okay, now we just need to dig another well a few 100 meters from here. They would just move on to another place. And it might be very politically incorrect to say these things, but it's simply the case. Without the technology that was brought here by Europeans, that land was just completely inhabitable for primitive societies. And this is why they stayed in the areas that were the best agricultural areas, because the areas that had the most water obviously correlates with the areas that are the best for agriculture. That should be obvious to anyone watching.
And you're saying that it was the apartheid government's decision, and they actually had to expropriate white people who owned farms in those areas to leave that territory to the people who had already settled there and were working that land as much as they could.
Yes, the apartheid government expropriated. I would lie if you give you the exact amount, but it was quite a significant portion of what would later become the Bantustans were expropriated from white farmers.
So, Willem, I mean, that sounds to me like if you're in the genocide business, that's a pretty bad strategy. You know, we're constantly told about the fact that the land was taken, that people were ruthlessly oppressed, that it was a genocide, people were killed off. Clearly, some of this is just not true. Clearly, some of this, when you inspect the actual detail of what was going on in the early 1900s, it would be abundantly evident to anybody that some of these policies could be regarded as quite progressive and forward-thinking, and certainly trying to marry what was there before and what kind of civilization was in existence with where the country was looking to go. And obviously, Black people were very much factored into that.
Yes, I think if you look at apartheid as a holistic concept, why did it begin in the first place? It was mostly because of the pressure from the poor white people that wanted apartheid. Yes. And to explain it to you like this, so I did explain at the beginning of the video after the Boer War that most people lost everything, they were destitute. And then most of these people would move to the old capital cities of the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, which is the Witwatersrand and Pretoria. Mostly the Witwatersrand, because that was where most of the first and the earliest gold mines were built. They only very later discovered that there was actually a lot more gold in Welkom than in Johannesburg. So most of these gold mines were in Johannesburg, and these people just moved there because they had no other economic option. That's the only way they're going to put food on the table for their...
When you talk about the poor white people,
yes.
If they were looking for a place to go and they couldn't get to the Witwatersrand, they didn't have very many options, did they?
No, I think most people went to these to the Witwatersrand because that was basically one of the only few economic centers that there was money in order to get a job, and that was on the gold mine. Some people went to Kimberley, but a lot less. But in any case, the bigger point I wanted to make was it was first white people that moved there to start working on the mines. Then the mining companies saw that the black people were willing to work for even less. So there were very, very, very few black people living in the old capitals of the Transvaal Republic before the Union of South Africa. It was basically all white cities. The old Boer republics were majority white. Most black people, the vast majority of black people in that time still lived in parts of the Eastern Cape and Natal of today. And then these mining companies would actively incentivize getting all these black men out of their communities in Zululand and putting them in the mining settlements or the townships and close to the mine so that they can exploit them for cheap labor. Same thing with the Transkei, same thing with basically all the different black areas that existed back before the Union of South Africa. And then what this caused was that you basically had a completely unsegregated slum of dirt poor people, and them being white, black, even some coloreds, even some Indians that were taken from Natal, and they were all just basically put there in a slum that was for the poor people that had no money to actually afford an actual house. And the white people that were the descendants of the Boer people that were living there come from an extremely high caste society. They come from a society within the Boer republics where crime was virtually non-existent. It's just not a concept that they knew. And now they are sitting in the slums, and the first big issue that they run into is a massive crime rate, especially petty crime. Like, you can't even leave your stuff unattended because then it will get stolen. There's also an epidemic of violent crime within these slums, not as bad as the petty crime, or not as numerous as the petty crimes, but violent crime also suddenly exists here. And these families started uprising and saying, no, we're not going to take it. We want apartheid. We want separateness. We don't want to live with these people because they are stealing our stuff. They are sexually assaulting our daughters, etc., etc. And that was the main driving force behind why apartheid was later introduced. The other main driving force came in the 1920s, about a decade later. Then they started complaining about the crime issue. They started complaining about the wage issue. They started complaining about the fact that more and more black people were almost imported from Zululand and from the Transkei and wherever to the mines in order to drive down their wages. And then the South African Communist Party, which was then still a white nationalist party, had an uprising with all of these signs that said, white workers of the world unite, and workers of the world unite for a white South Africa. Like, it was almost equally as white-centered as it was communism-centered. Then, of course, Jan Smuts, the uprisings got so bad that Jan Smuts actually sent in the Air Force to drop bombs on these white protesters. And that was basically the end of the Smuts regime, because that basically made him lose all popularity amongst all white people from all creeds and all social classes. They just said, this is inhumane, you can't do this. Like, imagine a leader today would do that. Say there's a bunch of mine workers striking and you send in the Air Force and drop some bombs on them. Like, it's unthinkable in today's zeitgeist. But in any case, so then Jan Smuts was basically, he became too unpopular to be elected again, and they elected General Barry Hertzog, which was then, he didn't win a majority of the vote, so he had to actually take hands with the Communist Party. And for a brief period of time, we had the coalition between the Afrikaner nationalists and the communists who ruled South Africa. And they basically introduced apartheid. And they also introduced many laws that was, sort of minimum wages and fixed wages for different jobs. And then also the white nationalism part came in, which said certain jobs should be reserved for certain demographics, etc., etc.
We can lay another great ugliness at the feet of communism. I mean, rather than chalk this up just to Afrikaners, why don't the communists ever get the blame?
Well, I don't think the communists wanted apartheid in the sense that it was later developed into during the 40s. This was just like the precursor of apartheid.
Sure.
It was more the populace that was pushing for, we don't want anything to do with those people, than it was the actual ideology of the communists.
I'm aware of time here, and there are so many things I still want to ask you. Can I quickly just fast forward from that period with Hertzog to Milan, and from Milan into Verwoerd? And if you can just explain to me, through the exposure that you've had to all these primary sources, how you would describe, as a teacher to a school child, what happened from Milan to Verwoerd's assassination and how that developed into apartheid.
if we look at Malan, we must first look at the fact that Smuts was elected as Prime Minister again for a second term after Herzog. And to put that as simple as possible, for the risk of, being historically inaccurate, basically the Great Depression happened and the communists and Herzog got a lot of blame. And simultaneously, there was a split within the Afrikaner nationalist groups, and the National Party at that time, or Herzog's National Party at that time, split in two. And then Herzog took his faction and actually joined hands with Smuts again and started the so-called United Party. And then he was viewed as a traitor by, the more hard right people. And then we saw the rise of the Oswald Brandwag, which was basically this white terrorist group that was so vehemently anti-war. They said our people will never, ever bleed for Britain, never, ever again, because obviously we fought in the First World War as well. But they said they will rather die fighting the government than they would be put on a ship and go to Europe to fight for Britain. And then, obviously, a lot of these people were then executed and jailed and so forth. And the normal people on ground level, and even the people that were sent to go fight in the Great War, in the Second World War, was so angry at the pro-British United Party of Smuts that it basically caused that the National Party would never lose another election again in South Africa. The Afrikaner nationalists would carry every single election because everything that was just, remotely British, like for instance the Progressive Party, was seen as evil, and they were the ones that sent our sons to go die to fight a war that wasn't our war. So anyway, so Malan got elected, and he basically was the first one to mention the word apartheid in law and say that we were going to establish apartheid in South Africa. But the view of the more hard right, which was the Oswald Brandwag, for example, was not that they wanted apartheid. They wanted South Africa as a country to be split up back into the different republics that existed before the Union of South Africa. Because with the unionization of South Africa, 13 different countries were basically just one day told, okay, you guys are now one nation. But in any case, so they wanted to go back to that and said, we want our republics back, and we want, everyone to just have their little country and their space that they had before the Union back. And this was the goal. But then it increasingly moved to a more centralized state. And this is where the Afrikaner elites got a taste of power. It's not like we are separatists anymore. It's like, why do we want to be separatists and have our own little Volksstaat if we can control everything, if we can become very, powerful and very rich, which I think was probably the biggest mistake they could have made, because if they stuck to their plan in order to set up the Boer republics again, everyone would have been in a much better position today. But they got very power hungry. And then if we move to Verwoerd, he is a very complex figure. We talked about the Bantu education. He wasn't an egalitarian. He wanted the best for the black people, but he also wanted to move back to the idea that the Afrikaners need their own Bantustan as well. And he wanted to give more and more, independence to the black homelands. For example, he allowed them to write their own constitutions, even if these constitutions are in contrast with the South African Constitution. He actively tried to get them to elect their own governments, and at the same time, he was giving a lot of money, not just for schools, but also to develop hospitals, to develop roads, to develop, you name it, everything basically needed to have a civilized country, and at the same time try to educate a black elite within those homelands up to the level where they can become the elite of the homeland and actually govern the homelands. And actually, right before he was assassinated, he was starting to push to give full independence to the homelands, and then he was assassinated.
His idea then would have been, if he'd lived long enough, to make new countries, to create new countries and allow these countries to stand on their own 2 feet and manage whatever they could. What was his idea for an Afrikaner Bantustan? I mean, that's an interesting thing I haven't really heard a lot about.
No, his idea was that Afrikaners deserve a homeland and they should have a homeland of their own that they can call their own. That's nobody else's, it's only theirs. Just like the Bantus had, the Bantustans, like Zululand, is only for the Zulus.
Where was he going to put this? How was he going to?
Basically the old areas of the Boer republics, but a little bit smaller. So basically Gauteng, which is like the core of what the Boer republics were. No other people have any claim on Gauteng because no other black tribe ever lived in Gauteng, historically speaking. And then parts of Limpopo, but just like the southern part of Limpopo, obviously the Venda people and the Tsonga people have claims to the north of it. Then the Kruger Park, then some parts of Mpumalanga, but then he would have given some of the Swazi areas back to the Swazi people and then some of the Zulu areas back to Zululand. And then on the other side, on the western side, Northwest Province, roughly half of Northwest Province, if you draw a line down the middle, that's where he would have made it. And then the northern part of the Free State, the southern part, he said, was Sotho territory. So that was the idea. This was the historic homeland of the Boer people, and that's what he wanted back. Oh, and obviously also Vryheid, the Republic of Vryheid in Natal, which would have given the land access to the sea as well, so it's not completely landlocked.
Who were the main opponents to Verwoerd at this point?
The mine bosses, yes. The most accepted theory was that it was the mine bosses that wanted him assassinated, and they found a mentally disabled and also mentally basically a crazy guy to do it. Because by that time, they actually made black people citizens of their different homelands. And the mine bosses didn't want their cheap labor to go back to develop the homelands. Because you must also remember the homelands were quite destitute in the fact that the families that lived there, the wife and the children, lived on their own, and the husband was working on the mine and just sending money back to them, which broke up the families completely, and it also took the entire labor force out of the homelands and putting them in Johannesburg, which was devastating for the culture and the family unit. And Verwoerd wanted to get rid of that. And he had a very big, a project to reunite black families. So yeah, that's basically what happened. The mine bosses didn't want him to govern the country anymore.
I do like the way this story's come almost full circle. What eventually did happen post his assassination? Because people will remember John Vorster, but what did he do, and how did he take it in a different direction?
John Vorster is an extremely shadowy figure, like very shadowy. His brother Koot Vorster was a spy for the Nazis in the Cape, and then John Vorster was also in some way involved with that. It's very unclear to see how he was involved with that. But in any case, after the Second World War ended, both of them got involved with the CIA. And there's a lot of literature about that, but they had a very, very close relationship with the CIA. And John Vorster basically did America's bidding. You can put it as simple as that. When America said that South Africa should, for example, drop their support of Rhodesia, we did it because the Americans wanted it. When the Americans wanted us to start a war in Namibia, we did it because the Americans wanted it. And I think John Vorster thought that if he was going to be this great big puppet for the CIA and the American regime in South Africa, that would give the support of the American regime to South Africa, which to an extent they did. I mean, for instance, America had a lot of power, obviously as they have today, within the whole Western sphere. And when the United Nations voted on should apartheid be a crime against humanity, for example, Australia, Britain, the United States, the entire Anglosphere voted no. Most Western European liberal countries abstained from voting. And then the reason why it was declared a crime against humanity was basically because of the countries that voted yes, which was all of these, communist countries, Arab countries, Basically everyone that is seen as the enemy still today, the other side, the East Bloc, they all voted to declare apartheid a crime against humanity. So you sort of had the schism, Cold War schism between the East and the West. And South Africa was firmly part of the West. And you can see that just the United Nations resolution that I named now was just proof of that. But then after Vorster and during the time of Botha, basically the entire West, led by America, turned against South Africa, against apartheid South Africa, 180 degrees, and all of the things that Vorster did for America basically helped nobody anything.
I wonder how much of that had to do with apartheid and how much of it actually had to do with the Cold War.
No, I think it had everything to do with the Cold War, because it's it's just too what's toevallig in English? Coincidental that the fall of the Berlin Wall, perestroika, glasnost, and the end of apartheid all came at the same time. Well, the same period of time. It's just it has always been Cold War politics.
If you could get people who don't usually listen to you or to me to just take a second look at history, and particularly the history of the Afrikaner people. And, there are so many versions of Afrikaner people today that you can't really call it a community, because it's unitate vires, in unity, diversity. So even inside of Afrikanerdom, there is enormous difference of opinion, difference of culture, difference of ideas about what the future should be. What would you want them to know? What would you want them to know about the history, and what would you want them to know about the potential of Afrikaans people going forward?
Well, I think, history speaking, I would say people must be more curious. History is basically a consensus of ideas. It's not the truth. Whatever the ideas are that is popular, that is what history is. And I think whenever there was a struggle or a conflict between two groups of people or a war or whatever, these two groups would both write their own histories. And in each group's history, he would want to make the other group look as evil as possible and make himself look as virtuous as possible, and vice versa. And then when the actual establishment of the consensus of what history is happens, it's usually the group that dominated or that were victorious, their version of events are become the consensus of history. In South Africa, we have it very different in the sense that we had this consensus with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but then after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, history has been made worse and worse and worse. The Afrikaner people as a whole has been made more evil and more evil and more evil by the day. And this is why the black youth support more radical parties such as the EFF and not the ANC, because they think apartheid was way worse than the people that actually lived during apartheid think it was. And I think for white people in general and Afrikaners, that shame either increases as apartheid becomes worse, or they turn completely against it and says, no, we are not going together with this version of events anymore. But in any case, I think it's necessary for people to actually start studying these topics and try to get to the truth about them. And then concerning the future, this might be a very radical statement to make, but I think that the only long-term solution for the Afrikaner is to go back to striving towards a homeland for themselves, in the same sense that the Israelis strived for a homeland and got it, and the same way that the Israelis actually got a homeland and expanded that homeland. I think the Afrikaners should do the same here, because the final nail in the coffin for me, which convinced me completely that the South African dispensation we live in currently is never going to work, was the formation of the Government of National Unity. Because the Government of National Unity was supposed to be this government where all the different voices are proportionally taken into account, and then we get to a solution that not suits everyone, but that is tolerable for everyone, to put South Africa forward. But now we have then the Government of National Unity, and despite this, the most radical, the most abusive laws that has ever passed in South Africa since the 90s had been passed by the Government of National Unity, not by the ANC government. And that just shows me that if this didn't do anything to stop it, nothing will. And the Government of National Unity is not going to last forever. At some stage, the EFF faction and the Zuma faction and the old ANC that is now still the ANC are going to come together and say, let's put our differences aside, and the ANC will become a 60% party again. Because if you split up the votes of the ANC that they always got, the ANC and the EFF and the MK today got the exact same number of votes. And it's just going to be like that again and nothing changes. And then for the people that believe that there's hope in supporting the DA and that the DA can bring South Africa along, I'll just say simply that is not possible. The DA has never had more than 4% amongst the black population, not under Maimane, not under Steenhuisen, never. The only reason why the DA is increasing their vote share is because of voter turnout. Less black people actually go to the polls, and white people are, last time I checked, almost twice as likely to go vote as black people are, which makes them proportionally bigger. But at the end of the day, you can't wish for voter turnout to be low enough to actually make the DA win, because that would basically mean that almost no black people would actually have to go to the polls and vote. And in that sense, I think that all of these ideas that we have been sold of the Rainbow Nation is dead to me. I don't think it will ever work. I think the past 30 years have showed us that it will never work. And I think looking at the fact of the support patterns of people show us it will never work, because black people don't leave the ANC when they get disillusioned and go vote for more liberal parties like the DA. They go and vote for more radical parties like the EFF and the MK. So, yes, that's basically my message. Maybe next time I can tell you why I believe that the DA is going to lose the Western Cape.
I'd be interested to hear it. There's so many things here that people are going to want to pick up on, and I urge anybody who wants to know more, wants to disagree with you, to pay attention to the material that you've already made and produced, and then also to just follow you. And you know, like anybody these days, we're all a stone's throw away thanks to social media. But I really appreciate your time, Willem, and thank you for enlightening me on so many subjects. I need to go and do some reading myself after this. Obviously, there are going to be things that we disagree on strategically and in terms of politics, but I am delighted that our country has people like you in it who are thinking not only about what's next, but about what has happened in the past and paying the attention that it requires for you to be able to make sensible decisions. Most people just read a couple of lines on X and they think they know all about history. So there are lots of things that you've told me today that I'm delighted to know, that I'm going to have to go and research myself. And once again, thanks for your time, man.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Gareth.
This is The Truth Report, and there will be more of this on the way. So if you like what you've heard today, then like, subscribe, etc., and go and join Willem in his stuff that he's doing as well on social media and on YouTube and everywhere else that it's being produced. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.